Hello there everyone, my name is Nathan Birch. Today we're going to be going through our hands-on exercise 3 for lesson 1 in our JavaScript 2 course. So we are starting off with the zip file from our second exercise and we are going to continue to build on that. So first things first, modify app.js to use the following code instead of on click. So let's copy that, come over to app.js. Here's our on clicks on lines 4 and 5. And so we're just going to take those out and add those instead. Okay, so we'll save that. Next one. So notice here, we made this change that in our submit function, we could pass in a variable or a parameter. Okay, modify the IDs in app.html to follow a pattern. For example, radius, button or submit button, and output. Okay, and then we'll just add on area to each one of those. So radius, area, submit button, area, and output area. Okay. All right, next one. Delete the submit area function from the app or from app.js. So we'll take that out. Modify submit function with some if-else logic to call the proper functions and output to the correct places based on the parameter that was passed in circumference or area. All right, so let's go ahead and do that real quick. So there's a couple of things that we have to do. First off, we're going to get a parameter. Okay, so I'll just call this calculation to make. We can call it anything we want. And then let's go ahead and declare a couple of variables that we're going to need. So I'm going to say let output ID. We just said it was output, and then the other one was output area. And then the input ID, we had one that was just radius, and then one that was radius area. And so we'll go ahead and make a simple if statement right here that says, whoops, calculation to make is equal to area coming from right here. Then we'll go ahead and say output ID plus equals area, and then input ID plus equals area, so that they will match up with their IDs in the HTML. All right, next up, let's go ahead and call a function. Okay, so I'm going to say let user, well, we got it right there. Let user radius convert to number, but instead we're going to make this dynamic. So we're going to put this variable right here, input ID, which will either be radius or radius area. That will look like that. Okay. Dot value, and we'll go ahead and convert that to a number. Okay. And that function's right there coming in from our module validation.js. All right, now we need a condition very similar to this, but we are going to change it up just a little bit. And so let's see here. Let's go ahead and take that out. If user radius, I'm going to change the logic here. I'm going to say if there's not a user radius, then let's go ahead and I'm just going to say output an error to the correct div. And if there isn't an issue, then we'll go ahead and say calculate area or circumference, and yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to the next one. Create a new module called display.js. In it, create a function called output to element with 3 parameters. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file right here. We'll call it display.js. Guys, one of the coolest things about modules is that as you make them, you can use them anywhere. So this is going to be a really useful function that I could use in any application. All I would have to do is just import it. So output to element, we have an element ID, a value, and a color. Okay, use the parameters to output the value to an ID, then add a color if present. All right, so I'm just going to say document.getElementById, element ID, dot inner HTML equals value, Okay, that'll do half of it. And then let's go ahead and add a condition that says, hey, if we have a color present, because it's not a required parameter, then we'll say document.getElementById, element ID dot style dot color equals color. All right, and then let's add a default here as well, which will be pretty much the same thing as this. But if they didn't pass in a color, then we're going to just say, okay, we'll go ahead and inherit from whatever the class is that's being used. So right here we have black text. If we had purple text, then it would be purple text inside of that div. Okay. So that should be all that we need here. We are exporting that, so I'm going to go ahead and close this. And then it says import output to element into app.js. Okay, so I'll just say import and then output to element from display.js. Won't forget that again. All right, so now when we have an error and we want to output somewhere, all we have to do is just call that function. And so I'm going to say, I'm going to take that out. And if there's not a radius, we'll say output to element. Whoops. Output to element. And we'll have output ID, which we already declared. And we'll pass in the value, which is, please enter a valid number. And then we'll also pass in the color red. So it'll show up as a nice red error. Okay, so that handles that. And then for our else statement here, if we have a valid number, then we need to have one more if statement. So I'll say if the calculation to make is equal to area, then we'll go ahead and say output to element. We'll have our output ID, so it'll output to the same place, the output ID, and then we're just going to say, we'll use our backtick and say the area is, and then we can render some JavaScript in here. We'll just call our calculate area function, passing in the user radius. Okay, and then we can just add an exclamation mark there. All right, sweet. And then I will just say, well, let's just add an else statement. So if it's not area, then we'll say else. And then we can just say, well, I'll just copy this line of code. But instead we're going to call circumference, and we will call calculate circumference here instead. Okay. All right. All right, so this won't go in there if there wasn't a radius, so we don't have to worry about trying to get out of this function early. I think we should be good. Let's go ahead and test our code and make sure it's working. So I'm just going to right click in here and say open with live server. And close these. All right. And let's test our errors first. Okay, look, please enter a valid number. And so if I was going to look with a breakpoint at where that's going, oh, that's not good. We'll have to look at that error here in a sec. Yeah, so we have an error with the second one. And it's probably because this ID is now submit button area. And that's submit area button. So we'll save that. All right, our error's gone. Okay, good. So we can get those to show up in the same place. And that's really great because we only have one line of code outputting an error here. Okay, yeah, it takes a little bit more effort up front to put in some of this logic, but I have one line of code that is outputting an error in red to different places based on an output ID because I wrote a function to do that for me. And I can just call that function anytime I want. And because it's in a module, I can just import it into any JavaScript file that I want as well, which is pretty amazing. Let's make sure this is still working. If I put in like 25 and hit submit, okay, and then let's put in like, well, we'll put in 25 again for the circle area, and it looks like it's working for us. Okay, and so we have code running across 4 different files. Okay, now you might be like, wow, that's really intense. Well, it's actually really nice because anytime I want to validate something, I can validate it all in one place. and then include that validation file in any one of my JavaScript programs. If I want more functions like output to element, which makes it really easy to manipulate the DOM and do things that I was doing repetitiously, now I only have to do it in one place. Okay, and I can just call those functions. With circle calculator, okay, I have a couple of functions working with circles. We could go ahead and add another one. In fact, let's go ahead and add one real fast. And I'm going to say calculate sphere volume from, we'll say radius because that's what we have, from radius. All right, so 4/3 times pi times r cubed will get us the volume of a sphere. So let's head over to our circle calculator. And I'll just say export function calculate sphere volume with the radius being passed in. And then we'll just say return 4/3 times math.pi times r to the third power. Okay, and that should give us our sphere volume for us. Okay, now let's say I wanted to add this into my program. Okay, I could just say, okay, I also want to include calculate sphere volume. It found it for me. And then over here, let's just add a little bit more HTML. Oh, whoops. So copy that and paste it, and say sphere volume. And then right here, we'll say radius, and we'll just say volume for each of these areas. Okay, I'm keeping the same pattern so that when I come here to my submit function, I can just say else if calculation to make is equal to volume. Then we'll say, we'll just change these output and input IDs to have volume on the end instead of area, like that. Then the last thing we have to do is just add a listener on that button. We'll pass in volume so that it'll match that. And the button is the submit button volume. And let's make sure that looks right. Yeah, submit button volume. Okay, after that, let's see here. I think we just need to add one more spot right here. Okay, so we just need to add one more condition right here. So I'll go ahead and copy this. Okay, and this time we'll say else if calculation to make is volume, okay, coming from right here from our parameter. Then instead we're going to say calculate volume. Okay. All right, well, I've never done this before. Let's see if it works. All right, I'm going to come back over here, hit refresh. We don't have any errors showing up here. We have our extra HTML. We'll put in 20 there. Good, 20 there. Good, and 20 there. Calculate volume is not defined. Let's see what's going on. Calculate sphere volume is what we called it. So let's copy that and paste it there. Whoops. Make sure we copy that whole thing and paste. All right. I just saved it. Let's refresh it. 20, enter, 20, enter, and 20, enter. There we go. Okay, so we have a circumference of 125, an area of 1256, and a volume of 33,000. Okay, so I'm not very good with math, but that sounds like it's right. But then we could also check to see if this will work. We didn't write any code for validation here, but let's check to see if, yeah, so we were able to output to this ID with the please enter a valid number, and we didn't have to write any code for that. Okay, the only thing that we added code for was to call compute sphere volume, and then to add the right IDs on there if it was volume. Okay, so pretty slick. I hope that this video was helpful in giving you guys a feel for how we can use modules and how effective they can be in kind of streamlining our work.